For the Memphis Police Department, the standoff represented a crisis unlike anything they had faced before. Officer Hester wasn't just a colleague, he was a husband, a father, a man with a family who was counting on him to come home safely. The psychological toll on his fellow officers was immense as they stood helplessly outside the house where their friend was being held captive. Every decision had to be weighed against the possibility that it might cost Hester his life, creating a paralysis that Sanders and his followers exploited to their advantage. The community watched in horror as their neighborhood became a battleground, with armed police surrounding a house where unspeakable violence was taking place. The racial tensions that had been simmering beneath the surface of Memphis society suddenly exploded into the open. Sanders had deliberately chosen to frame his actions in racial terms, and the media coverage inevitably focused on the broader implications of a black militant group holding a white police officer hostage. Community leaders found themselves walking a tightrope, trying to condemn the violence without inflaming racial tensions that were already at a breaking point. The impact rippled through churches, schools, and community centers as people struggled to understand how their city had become the stage for such a horrific drama. When communities face tragedies like this, it's important that we share these stories, ensuring that the lessons learned are never forgotten. The investigation. As the standoff entered its second day, the investigation into what was actually happening inside 2239 Shannon Avenue became increasingly desperate and increasingly sophisticated. Police commanders brought in every resource at their disposal: hostage negotiators, SWAT team specialists, intelligence analysts, and even federal agents who had experience with similar situations. But Sanders and his followers had prepared well for this moment, and they proved to be far more disciplined and organized than anyone had anticipated. The house had been fortified with barricades, weapons had been strategically positioned, and communication with the outside world was strictly controlled. The negotiation efforts were hampered from the beginning by Sanders' refusal to engage in meaningful dialogue. When he did speak to police negotiators, it was only to deliver rambling speeches about racial warfare and divine retribution. He showed no interest in resolving the situation peacefully, no concern for his own safety or that of his followers, and certainly no willingness to release Officer Hester unharmed. Intelligence gathered from neighbors and former associates painted a picture of a man who had been planning for this confrontation for months, if not years. The investigation revealed that Sanders had been stockpiling weapons and ammunition, studying police tactics, and preparing his followers for what he called the final battle. As the hours passed, the investigation began to focus on the grim reality that a peaceful resolution was becoming increasingly unlikely. Surveillance equipment picked up sounds of violence from inside the house, and attempts to establish visual contact with Officer Hester were unsuccessful. The evidence was mounting that Sanders had never intended to negotiate, that the entire standoff was designed to end in violence. Police commanders found themselves facing an impossible choice: continue to wait and hope for a breakthrough, or authorize a tactical assault that would almost certainly result in multiple deaths. The investigation had revealed the truth that no one wanted to acknowledge. They weren't dealing with criminals who could be reasoned with, but with fanatics who were prepared to die for their cause. The question was no longer whether violence would occur, but when and how much. The judgment, the decision to authorize the SWAT team assault, came after 30 agonizing hours of failed negotiations and mounting evidence that Officer Hester was in mortal danger. Police commanders had exhausted every peaceful option, tried every negotiation tactic in their playbook, and consulted with experts from across the country. The judgment call was made by men who understood that they were authorizing an action that would likely result in multiple deaths, but who also understood that waiting any longer might cost additional lives. The weight of that decision would haunt everyone involved for the rest of their lives. When the assault finally began, it was swift, violent, and absolutely devastating. SWAT officers deployed tear gas canisters through the windows, then breached the front door with explosive charges that shook the entire neighborhood. The sound of gunfire erupted immediately, a sustained barrage that lasted for several minutes and left the house riddled with bullet holes. Neighbors who had been evacuated hours earlier could hear the battle from blocks away, a terrifying symphony of automatic weapons fire, shouting, and explosions that seemed to go on forever. The aftermath was a scene of carnage that shocked even veteran police officers who had seen their share of violence. All 7 of Sanders' followers were found dead, their bodies scattered throughout the house in positions that suggested they had fought to the very end. Sanders himself was discovered in what had been the living room, multiple gunshot wounds to his head and chest ending his dream of martyrdom in a pool of blood and shattered glass. But the most heartbreaking discovery was Officer Robert Hester, found in a back bedroom where he had been tortured and murdered hours before the assault even began. The judgment had been rendered not by the courts, but by the brutal mathematics of urban warfare, where the only verdict that mattered was who was left standing when the shooting stopped. The community would spend years debating whether justice had been served or whether they had witnessed something far more troubling: the execution of 7 men who might have been captured alive if different decisions had been made. The criminal mind. Understanding the psychology of Lindberg Sanders requires delving into the darkest corners of human nature, where legitimate grievances become twisted into something monstrous and unrecognizable. Sanders wasn't born a killer. He was created by a combination of circumstances, choices, and a gradual descent into a paranoid worldview that ultimately consumed him completely. His transformation from a man with genuine concerns about racial inequality into a self-proclaimed messiah willing to torture and murder an innocent police officer represents one of the most disturbing aspects of extremist psychology: the ability to justify absolutely any action in service of a supposedly higher cause. The evidence suggests that Sanders had been planning for a violent confrontation with law enforcement for months, possibly years. His choice to call himself Black Jesus wasn't just grandiose posturing. It was a deliberate attempt to place himself above human law and human morality. In his twisted worldview, he wasn't just a criminal evading justice. He was a divine figure leading his people in a holy war against their oppressors. This delusion allowed him to commit acts of unspeakable cruelty while maintaining his self-image as a righteous warrior. The torture of Officer Hester wasn't random violence. It was a calculated act designed to inflict maximum psychological damage on the police force and the community they served. What makes Sanders' psychology particularly disturbing is the way he was able to convince others to follow him into what they all knew would likely be their deaths. His followers weren't mindless automatons. They were men who made conscious choices to participate in torture and murder because they believed in Sanders' vision of racial warfare. The criminal mind at work here wasn't just individual pathology, but group psychology gone horribly wrong. Sanders had created a cult of personality so powerful that grown men were willing to die for his delusions. The final hours of the standoff revealed the ultimate bankruptcy of his philosophy. When faced with the consequences of his actions, he chose to hide behind his followers' bodies rather than face justice like the divine figure he claimed to be. His legacy isn't one of martyrdom or resistance, but of cowardice and the senseless waste of human life in service of a cause that existed only in his diseased imagination. Reflective conclusion. The siege at 2239 Shannon Avenue ended with 8 men dead and a community forever changed, but the questions it raised about police tactics, racial tensions, and the nature of justice continue to resonate decades later. The 30-hour standoff became a case study in law enforcement academies across the country, analyzed and reanalyzed by experts trying to understand what went right, what went wrong, and what lessons could be learned from such a tragic situation. But beyond the tactical discussions and procedural reviews lies a more fundamental question about the nature of evil and our society's ability to confront it when it emerges in our midst. The controversy surrounding the deaths of Sanders and his followers, 7 men killed by police gunfire, many with multiple shots to the head, would fuel debates about excessive force and police accountability for years to come. Critics argued that the SWAT team had acted as judge, jury, and executioner, gunning down suspects who might have been captured alive with different tactics. Supporters countered that the officers had faced heavily armed fanatics who had already demonstrated their willingness to torture and murder, and that the use of deadly force was not only justified but necessary to prevent further bloodshed. The truth, as is often the case in such situations, probably lies somewhere between these extremes. What cannot be disputed is the human cost of the tragedy. Officer Robert Hester died a horrible death, while his colleagues stood helplessly outside, following procedures that may have cost him his life. 7 other men died in a hail of police gunfire, their lives ended not by their own choices, but by their decision to follow a madman into a confrontation they could not win. The families of all these men, police officer and militants alike, were left to grapple with losses that could have been prevented if different choices had been made along the way. The siege on Shannon Avenue serves as a stark reminder that in a world where hatred and extremism can flourish, the line between civilization and chaos is often thinner than we care to admit. It challenges us to examine our own capacity for both good and evil, and to consider how we might prevent such tragedies from occurring in the future. If this story has intrigued you, subscribe to the channel to learn about other real crimes that have shocked the world and the minds behind them. He beat and stabbed the hostage while police waited. The winter air in Memphis carried more than just the bite of January cold on that fateful morning of 1983. It carried the weight of impending tragedy, a darkness that would settle over Shannon Avenue like a shroud that refused to lift. What began as a routine call about a purse snatching at 2239 Shannon Avenue would spiral into one of the most controversial police standoffs in Memphis history. Officer Robert Hester had no way of knowing, as he responded to what seemed like another ordinary day on the force, that he was walking into a nightmare that would consume not just his life, but ignite a firestorm of questions about police tactics, racial tensions, and the thin line between justice and vengeance. The house on Shannon Avenue looked unremarkable from the outside, just another residence in a neighborhood that had seen better days. But within its walls, a man who called himself Black Jesus had gathered his followers, armed and ready for what he believed would be his final stand against a world he saw as irredeemably corrupt. Lindberg Sanders wasn't just another criminal. He was a man consumed by delusions of grandeur and racial hatred, leading a group that would soon turn a simple police call into a blood-soaked siege. The events that would unfold over the next 30 hours would test every protocol, challenge every assumption, and leave a community grappling with questions that had no easy answers. What happens when negotiation fails? When does patience become complicity? And in the chaos of urban warfare, how do we distinguish between justice and execution? The answers would come written in blood and gunpowder, leaving scars that Memphis would carry for decades to come. The origins. Lindberg Sanders didn't become Black Jesus overnight. His transformation from man to self-proclaimed Messiah was a gradual descent into a darkness that would ultimately consume not just him, but everyone who crossed his path. Born into poverty in the American South, Sanders had witnessed firsthand the brutal realities of racial inequality that plagued the nation in the mid-20th century. But where others found strength in struggle or hope in progress, Sanders found only rage and a twisted sense of divine purpose. He began gathering followers in the late 1970s, men who, like him, felt abandoned by society and drawn to his message of racial superiority and violent resistance. The house on Shannon Avenue had become more than just a residence. It was a fortress, a sanctuary for Sanders and his disciples who believed they were preparing for a holy war. Neighbors had grown accustomed to the strange comings and goings, the hushed conversations, and the occasional glimpse of weapons being carried inside. Sanders preached that the white establishment would eventually come for them, and when that day arrived, they would be ready. His followers hung on his every word, their devotion absolute, their willingness to die for his cause unquestioned. They stockpiled weapons, ammunition, and supplies, turning the modest home into an armed compound. The irony wasn't lost on those who knew Sanders before his transformation. He had once been articulate, even charismatic in conventional ways. But somewhere along the line, legitimate grievances had curdled into something far more dangerous. His rhetoric became increasingly violent, his worldview increasingly paranoid. He spoke of himself as a divine figure, chosen to lead his people in a final battle against their oppressors. His followers believed him completely, and in their belief they found the courage to follow him into what they all knew would likely be their deaths. The stage was set for a confrontation that would test not just their resolve, but the very foundations of law enforcement in Memphis. When stories like these unfold, they remind us how quickly ordinary people can be drawn into extraordinary darkness. The first signs. The morning of January 11th, 1983, began like any other for the residents of Shannon Avenue. Children walked to school, adults headed to work, and the rhythm of daily life continued its familiar beat. But inside 2239 Shannon Avenue, tension had been building for weeks. Sanders had become increasingly agitated, convinced that law enforcement was closing in on his operation. His paranoia, once confined to late-night rants, had begun to infect the entire household. Weapons were checked and rechecked, positions were assigned, and final preparations were made for what Sanders called the Day of Reckoning. The purse snatching that would trigger the entire catastrophe was almost certainly not random. Whether it was a deliberate provocation or simply the final straw in Sanders' deteriorating mental state, it served as the spark that would ignite a powder keg that had been building for months. When the victim called police to report the crime, she had no idea she was setting in motion events that would leave 8 men dead and a community forever changed. The call itself was routine, a simple theft, the kind that patrol officers handled dozens of times each week. But this call was different, though no one could have known it at the time. Officer Robert Hester was a veteran of the Memphis Police Department, a man who had seen his share of domestic disputes, petty crimes, and urban violence. He approached the Shannon Avenue address with the casual confidence of someone who had handled thousands of similar calls. But as he stepped out of his patrol car and walked toward the front door, he was walking into a trap that had been months in the making. Sanders and his followers were ready, armed, and absolutely convinced that this was the beginning of the war they had been preparing for. The first sign that something was terribly wrong came when Hester knocked on the door and found himself staring down the barrel of a gun. In that moment, a routine police call became a hostage situation that would captivate and horrify the nation. The escalation. The moment Officer Robert Hester found himself face-to-face with armed militants, the situation exploded beyond anyone's ability to control. What should have been a simple investigation into a purse snatching became an armed standoff that would test every protocol and procedure in the Memphis Police Department's playbook. Hester, a seasoned officer with years of experience, quickly realized he was in far more danger than any routine call should have presented. The men who confronted him weren't ordinary criminals. They were true believers, armed and prepared to die for their cause. Sanders and his followers had been anticipating this moment for months, and they moved with the precision of a military unit. Hester was quickly overpowered and dragged inside the house, becoming a pawn in a deadly game that Sanders had been planning since he first declared himself Black Jesus. The officer's radio crackled with his last transmission before disappearing into the fortress that 2239 Shannon Avenue had become. Within minutes, backup units arrived to find the house barricaded and heavily fortified, with no sign of their fellow officer except his abandoned patrol car sitting ominously in the driveway. The Memphis Police Department found itself facing a nightmare scenario. One of their own was trapped inside a house with armed militants who had already demonstrated their willingness to use violence. The neighborhood was quickly evacuated as more and more officers arrived on the scene, transforming the quiet residential street into a war zone. Sanders and his followers had achieved exactly what they wanted: a confrontation with law enforcement that would, in their minds, validate everything they had been preaching about the coming race war. But for the police commanders trying to manage the crisis, every decision carried life or death consequences, not just for Officer Hester, but for everyone involved. The escalation had begun, and there would be no turning back. The question that haunted everyone was simple: how do you negotiate with someone who wants to die? The crime. Inside the house on Shannon Avenue, Officer Robert Hester was living through a nightmare that would ultimately cost him his life. While police commanders outside debated tactics and strategies, Sanders and his followers were subjecting their hostage to hours of brutal torture. The beating began almost immediately after Hester was dragged inside. But it wasn't random violence. It was calculated, methodical, designed to break both his body and his spirit. Sanders saw the captured officer not as a human being, but as a symbol of everything he hated about the system he was fighting against. The torture escalated throughout the long hours of the standoff. Hester was beaten with various objects, his uniform torn from his body, his dignity stripped away along with his clothes. But Sanders wasn't content with physical violence alone. He subjected the officer to psychological torture as well, forcing him to listen to rants about racial superiority and the coming apocalypse. The other members of the group participated willingly, each taking turns inflicting pain on a man whose only crime was responding to a call for help. The stabbing came later, after hours of beatings had left Hester barely conscious and fighting for his life. What makes this crime particularly horrifying is that it unfolded while police negotiators outside were still trying to find a peaceful resolution. Every hour that passed, every attempt at communication, every effort to de-escalate the situation was happening while an innocent man was being tortured and murdered just yards away. The irony was cruel and absolute. While the Memphis Police Department followed protocol and tried to save lives, one of their own was dying a slow, agonizing death at the hands of the very people they were trying to reason with. Sanders had never intended to negotiate. He had planned from the beginning to use Hester's suffering as a weapon against the police, knowing that their adherence to procedure would give him the time he needed to complete his grisly work. The crime wasn't just murder. It was a calculated act of terrorism designed to inflict maximum psychological damage on law enforcement and the community they served. The impact. The news of the standoff spread through Memphis like wildfire, transforming a quiet residential neighborhood into the epicenter of a media circus that would captivate the nation. Television crews arrived within hours, their cameras capturing the tense faces of police officers, the worried expressions of neighbors, and the controlled chaos of a major law enforcement operation in progress. But what the cameras couldn't capture was the growing sense of dread that settled over everyone involved as the hours stretched on without resolution. The impact of the crisis extended far beyond Shannon Avenue, reaching into the highest levels of city government and touching the lives of countless families who watched the drama unfold on their television screens.